All right, so a lot of what I'm doing here is talking about. I just realized I feel like. There was a slide I skipped, but. No. It must be coming up and I thought I might have skipped it. All right, so a lot of what I'm doing here is basically getting ready to talk about the clash between the United States and US citizens, the majority of which were US citizens in Texas. What I end up referring to as the Texas-Mexican War in 1836. And so essentially, first I'm talking about what happens in Mexico up to 1836. And then after that, I'll talk about what happens with the United States up to 1836. And then we talk about the Alamo, although probably won't get to that today. So that's kind of the big picture of why I'm talking about all this. So at the beginning of the century, Mexico fights its War of Independence. Then what happens after that? Iturbide, who was that person I mentioned who switched sides and brought an end to this war. Initially, they didn't decide to follow the example of the United States. They decided to create something that was more similar to the types of governments that existed in Europe, and so then initially, Mexico has an emperor, not a president. So before, this can be a little confusing. Before there was the first president, there was an emperor. And so Iturbide was emperor of Mexico, 1821 to 1824. Now, 3 years later, they decided that instead of following the example of European countries, they instead wanted to follow the example of the United States. And so they draft a constitution and they follow the example of the United States by, instead of calling themselves the United States of America, they call themselves the United States of Mexico. And again, that's their official name today. So then we have Victoria, who was one of those guerrilla fighters during the second half of the War of Independence, who becomes the first president, as I mentioned earlier, in 1824. Then we have the second president, Guerrero, who abolishes slavery. And then in the late 1820s, Mexico experiences something similar to the US's War of 1812, where, even though we had already won a war of independence against our European colonial masters, there was another war after that against them. And so the US had the War of 1812. Mexico has a war against Spain. And there's a general by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who is successful at the Battle of Pueblo Viejo in 1829, which helped make him a hero of Mexico. And similar to the United States, where in the 19th century, if you were a successful military general, you became a top contender for president. And so that happened in the US and that happened in Mexico too. So he's recognized as a hero in 1829 that helped get rid of Spain again. And then in 1833, he becomes president. Now he's elected as a liberal, but he doesn't do much presiding. He basically lets his vice president do most of the president work. And then he decides that he doesn't like the liberal things that his vice president was doing. And so he helps draft the Constitution of 1836, also known as the Seven Laws, Las Siete Leyes, and he takes a centralist conservative turn. And so in 1836, he decides to give more power to himself, give more power to the national government, and allow for less states' rights. That puts him at odds, especially with the parts of Mexico that are furthest from the Mexican capital. And so that puts him at odds with the US citizens who were moving to Texas at that time and bringing slavery with them. And I'll talk more about that in a second when I focus on the US side of the coin. There's a picture, a couple, like a painting. This is probably also a painting. Paintings of Antonio Lopez Santana. Here he's remembered as a young, kind of military hero. And here he's remembered as a kind of old, washed up politician that failed Mexico. Painting of the Battle of Pueblo Viejo. Now, because Spanish America and Mexico were such large territories from the start, like the US was able to expand, kind of start small and expand. And I think carry with them this identity of being, member of a colony, then member of a state, but also of the country, the United States. Spanish America and then Mexico were very large from the start. And this is before modern times where people can communicate and travel easily. And so that means that the people in the different regions had strong regional identities and not a very strong national identity. And so in the parts that end up becoming part of the United States, you had people in Mexican California who identified as Californios. You had people in Texas that identified as Tejanos. You had people in New Mexico that were referred to as Manitos. And so these identities become important because they identified more with their region than with the whole country. You don't have to know rancheros. I'll just share a few pictures here because Californios were known for being good horsemen. They did all sorts of interesting things, including instead of lassoing cattle, they also lassoed bears. We have some pictures and writings from some of the Californias, the women of California.